The headline you're being fed is always the same shape. War, sanctions, cyber attacks, election interference, national security. The story is packaged like a moral drama because moral drama is easy to sell. You can put it on a screen, add a flag, add a villain, add a soundtrack, and people will volunteer their emotions for free. But that headline is the decoy, because the most dangerous battlefield in the modern world isn't a trench line or a missile silo. It's a spreadsheet, it's a payment message, it's a shipping insurance policy, it's a benchmark interest rate, it's a commodity contract written in a language you never see, enforced by institutions you didn't vote for, and weaponized in ways you were never told were possible. Here's the counter-narrative. What we call economic war isn't a substitute for real war. It's an upgrade, a cleaner delivery system for coercion, one that can strangle a country without firing a shot, collapse a middle class without a formal invasion, and trigger political implosions while everyone argues about values. The old wars destroyed factories. The new wars decide who gets to finance factories in the first place and at what price. And the hidden resource at the center of all of it isn't just oil or gas or rare earths. It's something more fundamental, the privilege of settlement, the ability to clear payments, price energy, insure cargo, roll debt, and access liquidity when the system panics. In traditional war, you count tanks and missiles. In economic war, you count choke points, reserve currencies, correspondent banking, SWIFT-like messaging rails, maritime insurers, commodity benchmarks, chip supply chains, and the collateral hierarchy inside global finance. That's where the power lives now, not in speeches, in plumbing. So when you see the spectacle, another sanctions package, another trade dispute, another national emergency, understand what's really happening. Someone is trying to rewrite the balance sheet of the global order, and rewriting balance sheets is how empires fight when they can't afford the old kind of war anymore. Let me show you the numbers, because this story is about scale, and scale is where morality goes to die. Start with the obvious. Global trade is the bloodstream. The world economy runs on moving real stuff, energy, food, metals, machine parts, across oceans. Roughly 80% of global trade by volume moves by sea. That means control over shipping lanes is important, sure, but control over shipping services is even more important. Shipping finance, ship classification, reinsurance, port credit, trade letters, and legal jurisdiction. Now zoom in on the post-1945 architecture. After World War II, the U.S. didn't just win militarily, it won institutionally. Bretton Woods built a system where dollars became the settlement language of global commerce. Even after gold convertibility ended in 1971, the dollar didn't die, it evolved. The system shifted from backed by gold to backed by demand, and demand was engineered through energy pricing, deep U.S. capital markets, and the credibility of the U.S. state. This is where people get sentimental and start talking about freedom. Don't. Capital doesn't care about freedom. Capital cares about liquidity, enforceable contracts, and exit options. The dollar offered all three. Then came the peace dividend fantasy. In the 1990s and 2000s, the US and Europe treated globalization like gravity, inevitable, permanent, apolitical. Supply chains stretched across continents because it was cheaper to make things where labor was cheap and regulation was weak. China became the workshop. Germany became the high-end machine room. The US became the consumer and the financial engineer. Russia became the fuel tank for Europe. The Gulf became the swing producer. Everyone told themselves this interdependence would prevent conflict. That wasn't naive. It was self-serving, because interdependence doesn't prevent conflict. It changes the weapons. The weapon became access. Access to the Western financial system, access to technology, access to insurance, access to the reserve currency, access to the normal pricing system. And when you can deny access, you can impose pain with plausible deniability. Here's the hidden history most people miss. Economic warfare didn't begin with the latest crisis. It's been refined for decades. Sanctions regimes grew from blunt embargoes to precision-guided financial targeting. Export controls became smarter. Instead of banning all trade, you ban the one component that makes the rest useless. You don't bomb a refinery, you deny the specialized valves, software updates, or catalysts. It's like taking the spark plugs out of a car and calling it nonviolent. Now connect the dots. As debt levels climbed globally, the world became even more vulnerable to economic war. Why? Because debt is a promise about the future. And if you can disrupt a country's ability to earn hard currency, refinance liabilities, or stabilize its exchange rate, you can turn that promise into a panic. This is why the modern superpower toolkit looks less like an army and more like a risk committee. Sanctions lists, export control regimes, anti-money laundering blacklists, secondary sanctions, and regulatory intimidation. Economic war became the preferred option because it is scalable, deniable, and politically cheaper at home, until it backfires. And it always backfires eventually, because every weapon becomes a blueprint for your enemy's counterweapon. To understand why economic war is more dangerous than real war, you need to understand the mechanism. Modern economies don't run on cash. They run on confidence, codified into systems. Think of the global financial system like an airport network. Planes are trade flows. Passengers are payments. But the real power isn't the plane. It's the air traffic control tower and the fueling infrastructure. If you control the tower, you decide who lands, who takes off, and who circles until they run out of fuel. Economic warfare targets the tower. Start with payments. International trade doesn't happen because two companies agree. It happens because banks intermediate the transaction. Letters of credit, correspondent accounts, clearing systems, compliance filters, all of it is a chain. Break one link and the cargo can physically exist, but it becomes commercially impossible to move at scale. Now add the most misunderstood part. Sanctions aren't just bans. They're risk signals. When a major power designates an entity, every bank, insurer, shipping firm, and commodity trader asks one question. Is this worth the compliance risk? And because the penalties can be catastrophic, most private actors self-sanction. Governments barely need to enforce. The market enforces for them. That's what makes it powerful. And that's what makes it dangerous. It turns private infrastructure into a battlefield. Next, export controls. In old war, you blow up the factory. In economic war, you cut the factory off from the one thing it can't substitute. Semiconductors, lithography tools, specialized machine parts, aviation components, industrial software licenses. Even if a country can build a chip, it may not be able to build the chip that matters, the one needed for high-performance computing, advanced weapons, or competitive telecom infrastructure. Here's a metaphor. Light crude oil is like champagne, easy to refine into high-value products like gasoline and jet fuel. Heavy crude is like diesel stew, thick, stubborn, and it needs complex equipment to turn it into something clean. Refineries are designed for a certain diet. If you sanction a country's ability to buy the crude it's optimized for, you don't just raise prices, you break the physical logic of industrial capacity. Now zoom out to the most lethal weapon, the cost of money. If you can raise the borrowing cost for a government, you can force austerity without occupying a capital. Bond yields aren't abstract. They are gravity. When yields spike, budgets become triage. Social spending becomes optional. Defense spending becomes constrained. Political stability becomes brittle. And here's where it gets personal. Pensions, mortgages, and corporate payrolls are all downstream of the same interest rate machinery. When central banks tighten to defend currency stability or fight inflation triggered by supply shocks, often caused by economic war, the pain doesn't stay over there. It shows up in your monthly payment. So why is the system breaking or shifting? Because economic war is now being used against large networked economies that can fight back. If you sanction a small country, the system shrugs. If you sanction a major commodity producer, a major manufacturer, or a major technology node, you're sanctioning the system itself. You're forcing the market to choose between compliance and survival. And markets, when cornered, don't choose morality. They choose workaround. Workarounds create fragmentation, alternative payment rails, non-dollar commodity pricing, parallel insurance markets, shadow fleets, reshored supply chains, and regional trade blocs. This is how economic war turns into systemic instability. Not because the weapon is ineffective, but because it's effective enough to force mutation. Here's the twist. The more you weaponize the system, the faster the system stops being yours. When major powers use sanctions, export controls, and financial intimidation as routine policy tools, they're sending a message to every other state and every major corporation on Earth. Your assets are safe until they're not. And once that idea takes root, everyone starts paying for insurance. Not insurance in dollars, insurance in optionality. This is the backfire. The intended goal of economic war is usually simple: isolate the target, collapse its currency, drain its fiscal capacity, trigger internal unrest, and force a policy reversal. But the unintended result is that the rest of the world learns the lesson. Dependence is a liability, and the response is diversification of reserves, suppliers, settlement channels, and alliances. So the paradox is this: sanctions can hurt the target in the short run while weakening the sanctioning power in the long run. Because the sanctioning power's dominance is built on trust in the neutrality of infrastructure. Reserve currencies are not just about GDP. They're about belief that the rules won't change overnight. The moment global actors think rules are conditional, they begin to shift marginal flows away. They don't need to end the dollar. They just need to reduce exposure at the margin, slowly, steadily, like water finding cracks. Now look at commodities. When you block access to normal Western markets, the targeted country doesn't stop producing oil, metals, or fertilizers. It reroutes, it discounts, it trades with intermediaries, it builds new logistics, and those discounts become a gift to buyers who don't want to comply or can't afford to. That creates a two-tier world: a compliant market with higher costs and a gray market with cheaper inputs. Guess who wins long-term? The industrial base that gets cheaper energy and materials. Manufacturing doesn't run on speeches, it runs on input costs. Meanwhile, the sanctioning bloc often ends up subsidizing itself, paying more for energy, paying more for redundancy, paying more for domestic industrial policy, paying more to reshore supply chains that were offshored for a reason, because it was cheaper. And then there's the most poisonous backfire: domestic politics. Economic warfare is sold as pain over there. But the inflationary impulse often comes home. Energy shocks bleed into food prices, transport costs, and manufacturing. Central banks tighten, growth slows, governments borrow more, people get angry, and suddenly the political system starts producing leaders who promise peace not because they love diplomacy, but because the electorate can't afford the macroeconomic collateral damage. So the irony is brutal. Economic war, meant to preserve geopolitical dominance, can end up destabilizing the domestic legitimacy that dominance depends on. And there's a deeper irony still. By forcing adversaries to innovate around Western choke points, the West is effectively funding the R&D of its challengers. Not with grants, with pressure. Parallel payment systems, regional currency swaps, local currency commodity trade, alternative chip ecosystems, new shipping and insurance networks. These weren't theoretical projects. They become necessary the moment the old system becomes hostile. You can't keep a monopoly by reminding customers you can shut off their service whenever you feel like it. That's the backfire. Now bring it home, because the real punchline of economic war is that you are the collateral. When economic war escalates, you get hit in three places: prices, rates, and jobs. First, prices. Energy is not just something you put in your car. Energy is the input beneath all inputs. It's fertilizer production, it's logistics, it's plastics, it's heating. It's the cost of moving every calorie and every component. When energy markets fragment, when supply is rerouted, when shipping insurance becomes political, when refineries can't access the feedstock they were built for, you don't get a clean shortage. You get volatility, and volatility is the silent tax that kills planning. Second, rates. Economic war has a nasty habit of triggering inflation through supply constraints. Central banks respond with higher interest rates, and higher rates are a transfer payment from borrowers to lenders, except most households are net borrowers. Mortgages reset, credit card interest bites, business loans get more expensive, hiring freezes spread quietly before layoffs ever become headlines. This is why economic war is more dangerous than real war for the average citizen. Real war is episodic and visible. Economic war is chronic and invisible. It leaks into your life through monthly statements. It makes you poorer without a formal declaration. Third, Jobs. When supply chains become geopolitical, companies stop optimizing purely for cost and start optimizing for survivability. That sounds patriotic until you see the bill. Redundancy means higher operating costs. Higher costs mean either higher prices or lower margins. If margins shrink, capital doesn't become loyal. Capital cuts headcount, automates, or relocates to where the inputs are cheaper. Remember the rule. Capital doesn't care about politics, it cares about margins. And here's the part nobody wants to say out loud. In an economic war environment, your retirement is no longer just a function of the market. It's a function of geopolitics. If your pension fund is loaded with long-duration bonds, rising rates can smash valuations. If it's loaded with growth equities, higher discount rates compress multiples. If it's loaded with international exposure, currency volatility can wipe out gains. If it's loaded with domestic industrial plays, input shocks can wreck earnings. Your portfolio becomes a hostage to decisions made in security meetings, not earnings calls. And the middle class, which lives on predictable cash flows, salary, mortgage, retirement contributions, hates unpredictability. The rich can hedge. They can buy hard assets, diversify globally, access private markets. The poor get assistance or fall through the cracks. The middle gets squeezed because it's too big to bail out and too politically fragmented to protect. That's the doom factor. Economic war turns the normal life of a developed economy into something that feels like permanent emergency, just managed through interest rates, subsidies, and propaganda instead of ration cards. Zoom out and you see the structural shift. We're moving from a globalized system built on efficiency to a fractured system built on control. In the old world, the guiding logic was, make it cheaper, make it faster, make it just in time. In the new world, the guiding logic is make it resilient, make it loyal, make it controllable. That sounds sensible until you realize resilience is expensive, loyalty is conditional, and control is an illusion. Economic war became more dangerous than real war because it doesn't just target armies. It targets the invisible contracts that make society function: stable prices, stable employment, stable savings, stable expectations. It's war conducted through rules, not rockets, and rules can be rewritten overnight. The next 6 to 12 months will not be defined by a single dramatic event. They'll be defined by compounding friction, more export controls, more industrial policy, more de-risking, more friendshoring, more currency volatility, more commodity segmentation, more quiet retaliation in the form of licensing delays, customs harassment, data restrictions, and selective enforcement. And the most important thing to understand is this. Once economic war becomes normalized, peace stops meaning no fighting. Peace starts meaning managed hostility. The global order won't collapse like a building. It will degrade like a road, one crack at a time, one workaround at a time, one new compliance rule at a time, until trade is slower, money is more expensive, and trust is replaced by verification. That's the real danger. Real war destroys cities. Economic war destroys the assumptions that made those cities prosperous. And when a society loses its assumptions, when people stop believing tomorrow will be cheaper, calmer, and more stable than today, politics stops being policy. Politics becomes desperation. Economic war is sold as a sophisticated alternative to violence, but in the end, it is simply violence translated into finance, pain delivered through prices, rates, and shortages. No smoke, no crater. Just a gradual realization in millions of households that the system they lived inside has been turned into a weapon. And once you see that, you stop asking who is right. You start asking who gets paid.